Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Rebecca Lammers. I am the chair of the Democrats Abroad Taxation Task Force, and it's my pleasure to be presenting the Demystifying Taxes and Voting for Americans Abroad webinar. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items to go over. So please don't forget to fill in the feedback form at the end of the webinar. I'm going to share the link again towards the end. Your feedback is critical to help inform us on events that we host in the future. So please, please, please be sure to fill that in at the end. I also wanted to highlight you should have gotten the link to this emailed to you already in the 24-hour and the 1-hour reminder emails that were sent out for this webinar. But immediately following this webinar, we are hosting a drop-in Zoom session for anyone, absolutely anyone, that would like to ask any one-to-one voting questions. So the link should be in the chat box now, and you can save it for after the webinar concludes. And this session is for those who need help figuring out how to register to vote. It's also the perfect place to go if you're too embarrassed or have a personal voting question that you don't want to ask during this particular webinar. So the link is in the chat box. I know that people cannot copy and paste links from the chat, but what you can do is you can click on it and it'll open in your web browser, and then you can save that link that way and join after this webinar finishes. Okay, so I have to read our disclaimer, so bear with me here quickly. Democrats abroad cannot provide individual tax advice. Advice requires consideration of your individual circumstances and needs, none of which can be done at this event. We are not tax lawyers, accountants, or advisors. Please consult a professional tax advisor, accountant, return preparer when addressing your personal tax matters. Democrats abroad does not endorse or recommend companies or individuals attending or hosting this event. If you are in need of tax advice, you can consult the IRS Tax Return Preparer directory to find an advisor or tax return preparer near you or providing online services to meet your needs and budget. Democrats abroad accepts no liability for any actions taken or not taken by participants in this event as a result of information obtained at this event or from a participant choosing a preparer either from the IRS directory or based on something someone said or did at this event. Okay, now we got that out of the way. So here's our agenda. Once we're done with the main presentation, I'll then do a public service announcement on Democrats Abroad to take a mini break and to talk about our tax advocacy work, and then we'll finish with the open Q&A. Okay, so we're going to start out with some polls, some interactive polls here. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up the first poll on your screen. So, our first question is, uh, if I vote in US federal elections, so that is for the president, House of Representatives, and the Senate, that's Congress, does that make me liable for federal taxes? So you can answer yes, no, not sure. I see answers are coming in. I'll give you guys a few more seconds to submit there. But what do you think? What do you think is the right answer? Uh, Give it another few seconds. You guys are good at polls. I can tell. Uh they're all you guys are coming in here. So um think I'm gonna go ahead and close it because it's kind of slowing down now. And it's been open for about it. I'll stop it in 5 seconds here. We're almost done. Okay. Okay, so the results are um well, most people said no. And you are correct. No, that is actually, sorry, I have so many things up on my screen here. Um, and so yes, the correct answer is no. But it's actually sort of a trick question because regardless of whether you vote or not, US citizens living outside the US are liable for filing and paying US taxes anyway. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute. But I have two more questions for you here. So let's get to the next one. So I'm going to go ahead. So the next question is, If I vote in US state elections, does that make me liable for state taxes? So our last question was about federal voting and taxes. Now we're talking about state elections and taxes. So what do you think? Um, you guys are getting better at this, so I think I'm going to close the poll a little bit sooner this time. But I see lots of answers coming in. So the options are yes, no, not sure. Uh, okay, I think we've hit critical mass, so I'm going to reveal the poll results. So it says most people said no, and you would be correct. And voting by itself can't deem you as a resident of that state and therefore make you liable for state tax. It actually depends on the definition of a resident for that state. And again, we're going to go into more detail about that here as well. But I have one last question for you guys. So let me bring this up if Zoom will participate. Uh, let's see, here we go. Okay, the last poll should be launched now. So the question is, I've never lived in the US, but I'm a US citizen. Can I vote in US elections? So what do you think? Yes, no, not sure. Um, I'll give you guys a few more seconds here to bring it in. Because we get a lot of people who have had children born abroad, and they we often get this. This is a very frequent question about whether they can vote. So I will go ahead and end the poll, and most people said yes, and you would be correct. You guys are good. Uh, and so if you've never lived in the US and you are a US citizen, you can still vote in US elections. And we're going to talk more about how that works right now. So I'm just going to take a step back here in terms of the tax side of things. We're going to break it down um, and talk about voting and taxes separately and starting with the different types of US taxes. So there are federal, state, and local taxes in the US. So the federal is the national level taxes. Sorry if this is basic for some people, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. And this is what every US taxpayer is responsible for. And then you have state income taxes that you could be liable for based on being a resident or working in or having a business connection with that state. And some states don't even have state income tax. A lot of states that don't have income tax just have like state sales tax. So, that really annoying thing where when you go to the US and they say, "Oh, it's $5," and then once they ring it up, it's actually $5.43 because of the sales tax. So a lot of people will pay local, and then lastly, with the local tax, you could pay local taxes for living in or working in a city, town, or county. And these taxes pay for local school systems, infrastructure, what have you. So those obvious, just really, really super high level, different levels of US tax that exist. So going deeper into the federal level of taxes, generally speaking, there is a severe lack of understanding in terms of tax obligations, especially for Americans abroad. So just taking it from a very, very high level, all Americans, regardless of where we live in the world, doesn't matter how long we've lived outside the US, and even if we've never lived in the US, we're all liable for US federal tax. This means that we are required to file a US tax return with the IRS every year if we meet the income filing minimum requirements. Now, this is where a lot of people get tripped up because just because you need to file a tax return doesn't mean that you actually owe any tax to the US. Statistically speaking, 60% of Americans abroad owe no US tax because we pay and are liable for tax in our country of residence first, because that's where we're resident. But we are still required to file a US tax return with the IRS for federal taxes to prove that we already paid tax in our country of residence and that we don't owe any US tax. I know it sounds crazy, but that is actually how it works. And again, that's the national, or what in the US we call federal level taxes. So it doesn't matter how you identify, whether you identify as just a US citizen, as a dual citizen, as an expat, or as an accidental American. If you have American citizenship, US citizenship, you have a US tax filing obligation for federal taxes. And this also applies even if you don't have a US passport or you've never gotten a US Social Security number, um, or even if you try to ignore your US citizenship, which I've heard from people. But that is how it works. So, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time to go into more specific details for your situation. That said, this webinar is part of a webinar series that we're in the process of hosting every Wednesday. And there are more than likely a lot of people on this webinar who are unaware of this US tax filing obligation. So, if you want to learn more about the who, what, when, where, why of US federal taxes, we hosted a webinar called How to Survive Tax Day for Americans Abroad last week, which lays out the basics of filing from abroad. And you can still buy the recording for that for a small donation. And we also have a number of topics around taxes that might be specific for your circumstances. So next week we're hosting one on how to get the child tax credit for American families abroad. We have a retirement webinar coming up as well. We have a webinar talking about how to legally avoid double taxation. So all of those are available, and the link should be in the chat box now, and will also be available in the follow-up list of links if you're watching the recording. So feel free to sign up for one of those to learn more about the federal level of taxes for your more specific kind of situation. Okay, so switching modes over to voting. Now that you know about the tax filing obligations, we're going to talk about the fun stuff, voting from abroad. Um, so did you know that all US citizens, regardless of where we live in the world, we have the right to vote in US federal elections? So that's for president and Congress, which is the Senate and the House of Representatives. And that is what makes up the US federal government. And we have the right, we as Americans abroad have the right to vote in these elections, regardless of whether you have ever resided in the US or not. And so if you have US citizenship, you can vote. Anyone who is 18 and over can vote. It's that simple. I've talked to a number of people who have dual citizen children who were born abroad, and they have the right to vote too. So if you have US citizenship, regardless of whether you have another citizenship and you're 18 and over, you can vote. So this is definitely something worth speaking to your, like, even if you have adult children that were born abroad and they've never voted from abroad, you should talk to them about this, especially this year. You can also vote in US federal elections regardless of how long you've lived abroad. And I've talked to some people who have lived abroad for 20, 30, 40, 50 plus years, and they didn't know that they could still exercise their right to vote in the United States. And you can do that because there is no time limit. So you have the right to vote in federal elections, and your right is protected under a law called the Uniformed Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, or UOCAVA for short. And this law protects all citizens' rights to vote in federal elections who are residing outside of the United States. It's that simple. That is how it works. So, the best way in order to register to vote from abroad is to go to votefromabroad.org. And I mentioned earlier that we're going to have the Zoom rooms that you can attend immediately following this webinar. But if you don't have time and you need to run off, you can just go to votefromabroad.org. Or if you have any questions or you need any kind of personalized assistance, you can email voterhelp at votefromabroad.org. We have a bunch of volunteers waiting on standby that are very happy to help answer any questions that you have about requesting your ballot to vote. Okay, so a little bit more about voting. How do you receive your ballot from abroad? So there are two different ways that you can receive your ballot. And the way that you register to vote is based on your last US address before you moved abroad. Again, even if this was 40 years ago, even if that building doesn't exist anymore, that is your voting address, and you can still vote from that address. So to register to vote, it happens on the state level. And for those of you that may have never lived in the United States, you would vote based on your parents' last US address. And again, it doesn't matter if your parents aren't alive anymore. It doesn't matter that if that building doesn't exist anymore. Some people that we've heard from couldn't find the address that they last lived at, but they were born in the US. And so they use the address from the hospital that they were born at, for example. So once you figure out the US address to register with, you sign up to receive either your ballot to be emailed to you or by postal mail. And really, what we recommend that you do is to sign up for the emailed ballot. The reason for that is that overseas mail is slow and it can take a very long time for your ballot to be received. And then for many states, they require that you have to physically mail your ballot back in order for it to be counted. If you request your ballot by email, they will email your ballot to you 45 days before the election. And if you request your ballot by postal mail, they will mail it to you 45 days before the election, and then you have to wait for it to arrive, and then it could take weeks, and then it could get lost. And by that point, by the point you get it and return it, it could mean that it's too late for you to return it by the deadline in order to be counted. So save yourself all of that hassle and stress and just request the emailed ballot. In terms of when they will accept the ballot, you really want to reduce any chances of your ballot not being received and not being counted on time. And this varies by state. Um, and this is one of the reasons why we really recommend that people tick the box to receive an emailed ballot. I know it's not as nostalgic as or as fun as getting the actual like printed out ballot, and like it can feel really exciting when you get that little piece of home mailed back to you, but it's just too risky these days. And we don't want you to risk any delays or possibility by not being counted. So we really, really recommend that you get it emailed to you and then you print it out and then you mail it back as soon as possible. So easy, easy peasy. So, how do I return my ballot? So we talked about how to receive it, how do you return it? Most states allow any one or combination of these options by email, postal mail, or fax. That said, these three options don't exist in every state. Each state has different criteria in terms of whether they will receive it back by email, postal mail, or fax. So, for example, like Colorado and Washington State accept by email. There's a number of other states that accept by email now, and but a lot of states still do require that you send it back by postal mail. So, and then also faxing is an option. Yes, the US still does faxing. It's a good option if your state allows faxing and you're nearing the deadline to return the ballot and you just want to have the peace of mind that it gets back on time. So, that is returning the ballot. And here's a map in terms of what state allows for what return methods. So, like Ohio, voting in Ohio, Where I'm from, I vote, and Ohio requires that I have to mail my ballot back. So I always tick the box to receive an emailed ballot, and then when I get my emailed ballot, I print it out on the same day and I mail it back, and they have to do that 45 days in advance. So ideally, you want to get that back as soon as possible to prevent any potential delays. So what does a ballot look like? Most of the time when you get a US ballot, it has three different sections. There's the federal section, like what we talked about earlier, but these are voting for president, House of Representatives, as well as the Senate. This year is not a presidential election year, unfortunately, but everyone will have a House of Representatives election on their ballot, and depending on your state, you have a 1 in 3 chance of seeing a Senate race on your ballot too. You may also receive state and local elections on your ballot as well. State elections are normally for like governor, the state house and state senate races. And then there might be some local elections that will include races such as for the mayor or city council. I've even had school board elections on my ballot for local elections too. So we've gone over the basics of how to vote at this point. So hopefully you're really clear on all of that. And just to reiterate that the right to vote in federal elections is protected under UOCAVA. That law that protects overseas voting. So every American abroad has a right to vote in all federal elections. There is no disputing that. Okay, so shifting gears back to state tax and voting. So this is where we get a lot of people emailing saying, "Oh, I don't want to be liable for state tax, so when they send me the ballot, I just don't vote in the state and local elections." To be clear, that doesn't actually do anything. Or they say, "I tick the box that says my return is uncertain." Well, I want to debunk this myth that there's a connection between state tax and voting. So, in the same way that you, as an American citizen, are liable for federal income tax, equally, you could be liable for state income tax. So, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this right now, but I want to add a caveat by saying that this will be based on your personal circumstances. And on a high level, it boils down to two factors. Number one, does your state have income tax? And number two, what is your state's definition of a resident and therefore state income tax liability? And do you meet that criteria? So it's those two main questions. Every state, so again, every state has its own definition of state residency and therefore liability of state income tax. It really does come down to your personal circumstances. One of the best ways to determine if you are deemed a state tax resident, if you don't know, is to look up the state's residency definition on your state tax administrator's website. Or you can actually call them or email them to ask. And there's a link here to the list of all of the state tax administrators' websites where you can look up their contact details. And yes, in some states, even if you haven't lived in the US for decades, even if you've not lived in that state for decades, you can still be considered a resident and therefore liable for state tax. This is a common thing that we hear from people, especially from California and Virginia. These states are known as like sticky states. So it's very difficult to prove that you are no longer a state resident of those states, unfortunately. But this is why we hear from some people from those states where they have specifically severed state residency and therefore their state tax liability by moving to another state before they move abroad. And you have that option. You can do that if you want to. But again, it depends on your personal circumstances if you want to do that before you move abroad. And one thing to keep in mind is that states use voting, they use voting as one piece of criteria to establish that you are a state resident. However, not all states do. The state could use voting as a piece of criteria. but they can't use it as a sole piece of criteria to establish residency in that state and therefore tax liability. A lot of states will use a wide range of criteria, like if you have a state driver's license, have a bank account in state, if you have a library card there, if you own property there, they're looking at specific connections for you in that state. They will not look at voting in isolation to determine state tax residency and therefore state tax liability. They don't do that. So if you don't have any other connection except that you vote there, and remember, your right to vote is protected under federal law, it's highly unlikely that you are deemed a state tax resident. Okay. So, registering to vote, another myth I want to debunk is that some people come to us and they're like, well, if I tick the my return is uncertain box on the absentee ballot request form, and this is like a screenshot at the top of the form if you were to print out the physical form, um, uh, then they say that they'll only get the federal elections. And again, it depends on the state. And not the state and local elections. Therefore, they can't get me for state tax. We know of no evidence, no court cases, nothing that demonstrates that anyone has ever been liable for state tax based on what box they ticked on their voter registration form. However, choosing the my return is uncertain on your form and not voting down ballot will do nothing to prevent you from being considered a state resident if your circumstances would otherwise indicate that you are a resident. So, for example, if you keep all of your possessions, including your young children, in the state, and try to claim that you aren't a resident because you don't vote down ballot, you're going to be out of luck. Or others have said to me, if I send my ballot back without voting in state and local elections, they can't get me for state tax. But here's the thing, your vote is private. No one knows who you voted for on your ballot. There's no way for anyone to know if you're voting in state and local elections. So going back to the whole idea of people saying, oh, well, I'm not going to vote in state and local elections because I don't want to be liable for state tax. That's not how it works. So I hope that helps clarify. And additionally, depending on which box you tick on the ballot request form can determine whether your state sends you just the federal elections or if they send you a ballot for all the elections, including the federal, state, and local elections. Look, every state is different, and the link on this slide takes you to a spreadsheet. The link, hopefully it's in the chat box there. You can look at it yourself. It's a big spreadsheet, very detailed, but very, very useful. And the spreadsheet shows you what each state does. So you need to look up your state and how they do it. And here I've taken a quote from the Federal Voter Assistance Program's website just to kind of say it this in a different way. So they say voting in an election for federal offices may not be used as the sole basis to determine residency for the purpose of imposing state and local taxes. If you claim a particular state as your residence and have other ties to that state in addition to voting, you may be liable for state and local taxation, depending on that particular state law. If you are unsure of your voting residence or if you are concerned about the tax implications of claiming a specific voting residence, you should consult legal counsel. So just looking at it from a different way. But it's worth remembering that some states have no income tax. So there's no state taxes to worry about. And this is the list of the 9 states that have no income tax. If you lived in one of these states before you moved abroad, or your American parent lived in one of these states and you're registered to vote in one of these states, it literally doesn't matter which box you tick on the form because there's no state tax liability. It's that simple. No income tax on those states, no problem. Um, Now, looking at these no income state tax, uh, sorry, excuse me, no income tax states, they all don't have state tax, but the way you fill in your ballot request form determines which elections you get to vote in. So I'll give you an example. When Beto O'Rourke was running for governor in Texas a number of years ago, I ran into a woman here in London who was like, "Oh yeah, I'm voting in Texas. I wish I could vote for Beto though." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And she was like, "I don't know if I'm going to go back, and I said my return isn't certain, and they're not going to send me the state elections on my ballot, so I can't vote for him." And I was like, "Is there any possibility, even like a 1% possibility that you might go back?" And she was like, "Oh yeah, I never know." And I said, "Well, if you just take the I intend to return box, since there is a possibility you may return in the future, then they'll send you the full ballot and you can vote for Beto." And she was like, "Oh, I never thought of it that way." And I was like, "Why not? These are critical state level elections for governor in particular, where the votes are just so close these days. Every vote matters. So if your state does that, nobody's going to chase you down and say you have to return. It's about your intent. And which box you tick is based on your own assessment. I personally have gone back and forth so many years where like sometimes I've ticked the I intend to return, sometimes I've ticked my return is uncertain. There isn't any a hard and fast rule on how it works. So it depends on your own assessment of that. Now, switching over to the other extreme, like an example of a sticky state, I noticed we had a lot of Californians on the webinar today. So, California has very, very detailed, very thorough, specific factors that they take under consideration to determine if you are a state resident or not. So I've kind of highlighted some of them on this slide, and they include voting as a piece of criteria, but again, they cannot use that in isolation to determine that you are a state resident, you know? It really does come down to your personal factors. So that's why this can be hard sometimes for people to determine because it is so personal. But this is how it works on a high level. So I hope that was helpful. I think we're going to go ahead and open the Q&A box. I'll just double check to make sure that that is enabled. Uh, Sorry, there was no notice there, Joel. Um, and Yep. Okay. So the Q&A box is now open. So please go ahead and submit your questions. While you are submitting your questions, I'm going to be just telling you a little bit more about Democrats abroad and our work. I don't see any questions coming in yet. I just want to make sure that they are coming in though. Uh, or maybe I've answered all of your questions. I don't know. Um, oh, there they are. I see them coming. Great. So, remember, look through the questions, even if you're not submitting your own questions, and like the questions that you want to hear, because we will go through the questions that have the most likes at the top and work through until we run out of time. But while you get those questions in, let me tell you a little bit more about Democrats Abroad and our tax advocacy work, specifically in the Democrats Abroad Taxation Task Force. So, we are a group within Democrats Abroad made up of volunteers from all over the world working hard to reform the tax and financial access problems for Americans abroad. Some of our advocacy work includes advocating for a switch to residency-based taxation, eliminating FATCA reporting for Americans abroad in our country of residence, exempting business owners abroad from the transition and guilty tax, and much, much more. You can check out more about our advocacy work by going to the taxation part of our website. And some of the things that we do for you include writing tax and we wrote the tax and financial access report on Americans Abroad that we did in 2022. We help host tax and financial education events all over the world, just like this one, and also submit statements for the record to congressional hearings and regulatory comments. We also do candidate outreach and education, as well as visits to Washington, D.C. to talk to Congress, the IRS, and Treasury. If you haven't read our report, which was our last big research report that we did, I really recommend that you do. This is a summary of feedback from nearly 7,000 Americans abroad on tax and financial access problems that we experience. And people I've heard from have said that after reading this report, they felt much more educated and less alone in dealing with the tax problems that Americans abroad face. So Please go and read that report today. We also, some of you also may be aware that there's a bill for residence-based taxation that was introduced about a year ago, and we continue to advocate for residency-based taxation in order to help address tax problems for Americans abroad. This is a top priority for us, and we are planning on sharing more resources as and when the bill is reintroduced this year. But in the meantime, there's a list of links there on the website to educate you more about the bill. And then I know I shared a slide earlier about our global tax webinar series, but we have a lot of country-specific tax webinars that are coming up as well, including from if you live in South Africa, Turkey, Canada, and Switzerland. So if you are from, or sorry, if you live in any of those countries, then please do check them out. They go into more detail on the tax issues and specifically for like banking and financial products in those countries, so you get more personalized info. Um, Lastly, I know I've hammered this throughout, and we've talked a lot about voting, but one of the most powerful things that you can do as an American abroad, especially this year, is vote. And I know there's a lot of fear mongering caused by Trump and his administration right now to repress the right to vote by absentee ballot, by mail-in ballot, through the tariffs. I mean, you name it, there is chaos, and it's daunting to look at the news right now. But he wants you not to vote. That's the whole point of what he's doing right now. And the best thing that you can do, not only to stop him in his tracks, but to help save America and to help reform the tax laws for Americans abroad, is to vote. Some people think that their vote from abroad doesn't matter, but I will tell you why it does. First, it doesn't matter if you vote in the reddest of red states or the bluest of blue. Every vote from abroad matters. Many elections are won now by a razor-thin margin, and it's the votes from abroad that make the difference in those tight elections. Secondly, we don't know the exact number of people who live abroad, but we do know how many people vote from abroad, since those votes are counted every election. We at Democrats Abroad then take those numbers and we walk into congressional meetings and we share that data with tax writers. Most didn't realize that so many people live abroad. And this helps us get American abroad issues prioritized so that we can get the laws reformed for Americans abroad sooner rather than later. So, the number one thing that you can do to help us help you is vote. Even though this isn't a presidential election year and we can't vote Trump out, we can vote his Republican allies out of Congress. There are also a lot of key state level races that will help protect the rights of our friends and families back home. So, if you've learned anything today, I hope you've taken away that your vote matters and you should go to votefromabroad.org to register today. You can also email us, and then we will also have the Zoom room that will follow this webinar too. So I'm going to leave this slide up on the screen and we'll share the Zoom link that you can join after, but we're going to do an open Q&A and I'm going to invite Ada up here. Let's see. I will add Ada up here, who is, we'll give her a big round of applause, a big, and have Ada helping out with answering. So I'm going to be taking the tax questions, and Ada's going to be taking the voting questions, and we will get through as many of the questions in the Q&A here as much as we can. So, let's see. Let me just refresh this to make sure that I don't. Okay, so the first question is, the IRS has changed a lot. Is there any insight on how they audit or treat Americans abroad? Um, uh, okay, sorry. Somebody then asked, how have they changed? I don't see it. Okay, so I think a lot of people are very conscious last year that when Trump came in, there was the whole Doge, getting rid of waste in the government exercise. As a consequence of that, what impact that had on the IRS specifically is that a lot of people left the IRS and they lost at least a third of their workforce. So they do not have as many people as they need. And this is one of the biggest concerns that I keep reading in the tax news at the moment is there's a genuine concern about having enough people, enough employees in place in order to process all of the tax returns required for this tax filing season. So whether or not it will be able to function on a basic level is, you know, is a question mark right now. The tax filing season opens next Monday. We'll kind of have to see how things go. But in terms of how it specifically impacts on Americans abroad, I haven't seen any news. I mean, I can tell you from people that I know who work at the IRS and also at the Taxpayer Advocate Service that it's a really hard place to work right now. You know, a lot of those people are very dedicated to serving their country, you know. They want to do a good job. And when so many people leave and then they end up restructuring internally within the service in order to make sure that they're covering the bases, it can be really demoralizing. It's very difficult for what I've heard people working there right now. But that's not to say they're still not doing their jobs. They're just doing the best that they can. And any of the kind of advocacy work, we did a lot of advocacy work in the last 2 years in particular on trying to expand services for Americans abroad so that Americans abroad get more support in the IRS. And all of those are basically off the table because the service has been completely decimated. In terms of audits or I mean, look, they're just not auditing as much as they used to. And in order to audit an American abroad tax return, often they will allocate resources to go after people who they think have either evaded taxes or are worthwhile. So they have to look at it from a cost perspective. Is putting a dedicated auditing agent on that individual worth the amount of tax that they will collect? And it's also a very specialist area as well. So I hope that gives you kind of like overview on that. Okay, next question. How is the requirement to file US taxes enforced? It varies. So, for example, some people I've heard from some people that I mean I heard from somebody in Switzerland that their bank in Switzerland asked for a copy of their US tax return to prove that they are filing their US taxes. And there have been times where people entering the country have been asked, when's the last time you filed a tax return? I'm not saying that that's going to happen to you or that it happens to everybody, but there are different ways that they look at it. But at the same time, you need to recognize that filing taxes in the United States is a voluntary process. So everybody, it's on the taxpayer to submit the return to the IRS. It's and so yeah, that generally is how it works. I hope that makes sense. Okay. So what is the punishment for not filing if you are a US citizen living abroad? How does it get administered? So for the there is a specific webinar that we are hosting that is called How to Get Caught Up on Filing Your US Taxes if you haven't filed or if you are needing to get caught up. The IRS recognizes that most people living abroad are not filing a tax return. If you statistically look at how many people are filing, so like the US State Department estimates that there are like millions of Americans living abroad, up to 9 million. And if you look at the IRS tax filing statistics for, I think it was 2022, there were about 1 million tax returns filed from abroad. So obviously there's a huge discrepancy there. But the IRS recognizes that, and so that's why they created this program which allows you to come back into compliance to be able to file a tax return without penalty. And it's called the Streamlined Filing Procedure, and we have a webinar specifically on how that works on March 4th. So I would recommend that you attend that webinar to learn more about how it does. But on a very high level, you would back file for the last 3 years, and you wouldn't back file for more years, even if you haven't filed for much longer than that. And you sign a declaration saying that you didn't know you were supposed to file. Um, in terms of punishment, that's, again, they recognize that people don't know. And so that's why they created that program so that you can come into compliance penalty free. Okay, next one is can you email your ballot for someone in the US to print and then post it for you if you put your signature on electronically? Oh, this is one for Ada.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. Let me try and field this quickly. So generally, we do not recommend this we can't say this is always going to be okay because many states actually have laws restricting who can handle ballots by anyone other than the voter. So that's good. That part's going to vary by state. But also, many states will allow you to return a ballot by email or fax. Wait for it. Fax is really e-fax. So you can still send it electronically. They get it as a fax. Kind of dumb, but this is how we live now. It's still better than trying to postal mail it. So if your state does allow that, please do use one of those electronic return options instead. But if you do need to return by mail and you are interested in this question, I would say, send a message to the help desk, voterhelp at votefromabroad, .org, or hop on the live voter help session after this webinar, and we'll have a look at your specific statutes. But it's not a it is tricky. It is easy to get wrong. There are also states that may it can't just be an electronic signature. It would still have to be, they need a paper original. So I'm not sure that, we have to just take a look at it.
Okay, thank you. I'll go to the next one. So also, oh, sorry, they're jumping around. If if I say that I am returning so I can vote down ballot, is there any repercussion for that, as I really don't know when I will return? I think that's another one for you, Ada.
Um, yeah, so if you say that you're returning so that you can vote down ballot, uh, the repercussion is that you will get a ballot. You will probably get a ballot containing all your state and local elections. Um, as Rebecca has noted, voting down ballot is not proof positive that you're going to owe state tax, right? It is never the only factor. They're going to look at a state tax board is going to look at the totality of your situation. So there's no other real repercussion other than enfranchising yourself to be able to vote. Now, you do need to, it is a sworn document, right? So you do need to you have that responsibility to be truthful when you tick that box. But as Rebecca says, this is a self-determined, it is literally self-determined. Like, do you think you are returning at some point? And so there's no legal standard by this other than the voter intention itself. Okay, so that's going to be, that's going to vary a little bit by state, but not a whole lot. That's the basic thing. There's no repercussion um, other than just getting a full ballot.
Great, thank you. If I haven't filed state taxes and they discover me, how many years back am I liable for? So here again, it depends on the state. Of the people that have contacted us, I would say that more often than not, the state is looking for you to pay tax for a specific year. Um, and I can't say that I've heard from anybody who has been asked to pay for more than 2 years. But again, it depends on the state. It depends on their definition of a resident. More often than not, a lot of people have been able to dispute it and they've been able to get out of it basically by proving that they are no longer deemed a state tax resident. So you need to have that conversation with the state tax authority. But if you submit evidence that meets the criteria for them to then determine that you are no longer a state tax resident, so like, demonstrating that you left the country 10 years ago or what have you, any I would say submitting more evidence than less evidence is going to help you get out of whatever bill that they say that you owe, if that makes sense. Okay. Um, Next question is, I don't understand how the secrecy of my vote is protected if I send in my ballot via email or fax. Oh, Ada, do you want to take this one?
Yes, I would love to. This is a process. This is involves the process by which your election officials receive your emailed ballot and your faxed ballot. And it's true, you do sign a waiver that says you waive your right to secrecy. This only means that the person receiving the fax or the email by definition, is going to see your ballot, right? And so you're acknowledging that fact. But from the point they have your ballot that you've emailed in or faxed in, that then gets transcribed. They're going to check your voter information page. They see, yes, this person is allowed to vote. And then check your ballot and they say, yes, this ballot is proper. And then they are going to transcribe that ballot over to their same balloting system, right? And then it gets tabulated with everything else, or it gets tabulated in the same neutral manner in which ballots are tabulated. It is not the same person who's receiving your email or your fax who's then going to be doing the tabulation directly. That's not typically how any of that works. So there is no mechanism that exists between the election officials and the state tax officials where they're going through and searching ballots for proof of owing tax. That there's no connection there. If people are worried about that scenario, this scenario, to our knowledge, does not exist anywhere and would be illegal if it did.
Cool. Thank you. Okay, next question. I think we'll take a few more questions and then we'll be out of time, but I'll try to get through as many as I can here. How many years back does the streamlined process cover for unfiled taxes? So you backfile the last 3 years, and also the last 6 years of FBARs. Again, I'm so sorry we don't have time to go into FBARs, but we do have a dedicated webinar on how to file the FBAR. It's basically a bank reporting requirement. So that is how you come into compliance through the streamlined process. Is my fear that our crazy president who wants to get the Nobel Peace Prize as well as Greenland can interfere in taxation for Americans abroad real? Uh, well, this is a very broad and open question. Um, if you could tell me more about what fear you have, I mean, on the whole, I would say, he's going after Greenland. Why do you think he's coming after you? Um, and what have you done? Um, look, I understand people are freaked out right now, and rightfully so, but he does all of this on purpose to suppress the vote. All of the stuff he has been doing in terms of stopping people from doing mail-in ballots, and with last towards the end of last year, implementing there was the change with tariffs on sending mail back to the United States, and that caused, we heard from people who were unable to return their not only their ballot but also their tax returns or their social security statements back to the United States. And these are all essential services that are covered, right? So he wants you to not vote. The and the thing is that as crazy as he is, he doesn't determine what the laws are. So the best thing that you can do is vote this year. That is the number one thing that you can do. And if we hear anything Otherwise, then we will obviously update the website, and there's a lot of information and resources on the Democrats Abroad website in order to debunk a lot of these myths. But as it currently stands, it's Congress who has the power to remove any rights around voting. And I know there's been a lot of the crazy bills that have been circulating around that, but nothing has actually passed. So let's hold them to account here and vote them out. Sorry, that was more of a soapbox, but I hope that helps. Uh, okay, so I'll do two more quick questions. How can Democrats living abroad contribute to campaigns? Act Blue now excludes us unless we are physically in the US when we make a donation. Oh, Ada, do you know this one? What is the current thinking on
So
this right
this
now?
is this is a question that we've been getting a lot. We are not in charge of Act Blue, and we don't have any control of what Act Blue, this decision by Act Blue to stop processing donations from overseas Americans. I would actually have to check. I mean, I think we have to actually check with Global kind of what the current thing is. Now, a donation
Hmm.
to Democrats abroad, we are still able to process. And, that's tends to be what we encourage because if you want to, be competitive in every race, getting out that overseas vote is actually the most important thing. And this is the largest untapped Democratic voting bloc, is that group abroad, and nobody goes after those votes like we do. So that's actually our recommendation is to please consider a donation to Democrats abroad. Um, yeah, and we don't have any magic for the moment regarding Act Blue.
Okay, last question. I am registered in Massachusetts, last place I lived, but would prefer to vote from a swing state. I have a rental property in another state, but haven't lived there in more than 40 years. Is there any way to change the state I am registered in? Ada.
So if Massachusetts is the last place you lived and that is where you vote, that is where you should continue to vote. Preferring to vote in a swing state is not does not confer the right to vote in that swing state. Owning property in another state, basically, if you that also does not automatically confer a right to vote in that state. You would have to declare yourself a former resident of that state. So if that is something you can do, like you go back and you are there for a time and you feel that you can say, it's a sworn statement, right? So if you feel that you can say, yes, I last resided in swing state, then you can ask, right? And I would say that if you do make that ask of change, anytime you're changing your registration from one state to another, which people do all the time. So I'm not trying to make it too scary. People change their registrations because life happens and that happens, and that's okay. That's normal. But if you do change your registration, make sure that the new registration is accepted first before sending a courtesy message to your former state where you were registered and let them know you are no longer voting in that state. This just avoids the appearance of being registered in more than one place, not illegal. It's illegal to vote in more than one place. There's no requirement to let your old state know, but it is a good courtesy. It is recommended. It is what we recommend to everyone. Let your former state know that you no longer vote there. And of course, if you accidentally receive more than one ballot, only vote one. It is election fraud to vote more than one ballot.
Awesome. Well, we've run out of time, guys, but thank you so much for joining us. If you have any more voter questions, you are very welcome to jump over to the voter assistant Zoom that is now open. So feel free to jump over there to ask any other voter questions. Um, I will also just remind you to please submit the feedback form on this webinar. Let us know what you thought about it so that it can improve our webinars that we host in the future. And yeah, that is it. Thank you again so much. Have a great day, evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are in the world. And thank you again. I think we'll stop.
Thanks, Rebecca.